Yeah. Sound good to me. This sound hard, something funky people gon' dance to. Give the record a second and a chance to. Hitting people like a scene of amazement. While they slipping back, my feet is planted in the pavement. Crumble I can never do. So now I'm looking dead at you. What are you gonna do? You listen to the knowledge of a scholar. You say how I breathe, tell them how I holler. I'm the E-double, and I proclaim my name. Straight up, good gang, peeps all game. I'm like a rhino, running through the roughest pack. They figure I'm a trigger happy nigga, so they step back. Breathe. The microphone is who lasts the longest, and who's the strongest. It ain't a game, it's plain to see. You listen to the sounds of breathe. There ain't no future in your front. I never got caught with a kilo, and if you ever do, yo, will never be with me, yo. Serve it in a Cherokee, or maybe it's a Geo. Black on black Benzo, we'll get it up, amigo. Never have to worry about my posse getting jumped, cause if we ever do, yo, TB, pop the trunk. Cause we don't go for playing, wanna play, go grab a ball. When I'm on the mic, I ain't for playing, not at all. Cause I clock 10 G's a week, booming at my peak. Always CE sober, but I do get geek. I can give you a job, a place to eat. Hardy, meet your homeboy Marty at a B.O.B. Party taking over, barking like a dog named Rover. I'm picking suckers like a four-leaf clover. They biting words on the mic, they some cobras. So now they saying egg breeders getting over. But ain't no future in your front. There ain't no future in your front. I'm the B, the R to the double E-D, and down with my homie G-A-S-N-O-E, and suckers causing static cause they still be disagreeing. I don't give a, cause I'm from F-L-I-N-T, in a city where pity runs slow. If you ever shoot through my city, now you know, cause we are strictly business and we also got a pride. And if you don't like it, I suggest you break wide. Suckers study looking for the M-O-N-E-Y, thinking that illegal is the best one, so they dying. I ain't got time to see a fiend out, to give up all his money and to give up what he got. That's the way I am, MC Bree cannot be different. Never change the ways for the world or the government. If I was the president, then I would state facts. You leave it up to me, I paint the White House black and ain't no future in your front. There ain't no future in your front. Yeah, I got dollars in my pocket, not from rolling. If I was a fiend, then my gold would be stolen. Put my name Breed on everything I own. And when I get my Jeep, I'm putting Breed on the chrome. Shine it up good, kicking through my neighborhood. Motorola phone, fat rims and a Kenwood. Put the kid around it, and then I'll have it drop. Just because the rotten people think I'm selling rocks, but ain't no future in your front. There ain't no future in your front. Yo, Flash, we ain't drop that, man. Why don't you drop it? True to the rules of the world. Live my life raw cause I never liked the law. Wear top 10s on my ass, use jeans. Selling big gates and tit for tat to the fiends. Cock much dollars but I never break a sweat. Time to move out, my posse saying, you got my back and I got yours. What time is it? Tear down the door. It ain't no future in your front. Never was, cuz. There ain't no future in your front. Yo, man, let's start this party up, right? Kick out that fat dance.
We Japanese still. You getting cooked in front of your family? Like a Japanese meal. It's Yasuta Hibachi and none of you niggas can stop me. But can't help but watch me. So look, bro. We back from a hiatus. For those that don't know, my channel did get struck. So I was not able to go live on Genesis 49ers for a period of time. After that period of time elapsed, my business started to ramp up, so I'm not going to leave thousands of dollars on the table for YouTube. I'm just not going to do that. So I had to make sure my business was straight, do all that, and I'm be honest, it's been whipping my ass doing that. So I've been putting all my energy and my time into that. But we back, y'all. As promised, I have been thinking about doing this video for quite some time, and even during the hiatus, I've been reading up on this, so I can give you guys a good quality look on this history. And just as the intro song says, ain't no future in your front. So we don't got a front about what actually took place during the time of the transatlantic slave trade. And what happens is, with people, they try to romanticize history, or they try to truncate everything bad that they don't want to associate with history. For example, with the transatlantic slave trade, what we're going to be dealing with today, most people don't want to own up to the fact that the African role was the biggest role. They were the biggest players in the transatlantic slave trade. If you do not have the African participation in the transatlantic slave trade, there will be no transatlantic slave trade. I want to just make that known. I just want to make that known because it seems as if you guys have a distorted idea of the past. And not just this, it's a lot of topics, but this is one of the major ones. And the distorted idea is this, that, you know, evil white people from Europe came down and invaded Africa and just started kidnapping Africans. They just started kidnapping Africans and taking them across seas, and that's how slavery transpired. And that's not the case at all. That's not the case at all. Africa, they were not for the taking. Like, you couldn't just run into the west coast of Africa, the Gold Coast, the Windward Coast, any coast, and just snatch people and then run to the ships. That don't even sound logical. Think about what you're saying. Think about the concept that's in your head when you visualize it. People just running in from a foreign country, don't know the language, don't know anything about the land, don't know the landscape, don't know the ins and outs and the working facets of that place, the government, or nothing. You're just going to wasp in and just start snatching thousands and thousands of people and run out the country. We got to start logically working these things out. So no, that's not the case. And a lot of Afrocentrics, a lot of you guys are mesmerized by people like Umar Johnson, Professor James Smalls. These people will try to glamorize the history because they don't want to show the dirt that our ancestors are involved with. They don't want to, unveil that. They want to make it seem as if our slates are clean and that we were just done wrong and we were just done dirty for no reason, that there was no participation on the African side. It was all an evil European game. When slavery in the west coast of Africa existed prior to European intervention, that's prior to the Portuguese coming down, there was already a system in place where we can own our ancestors, and I can speak on this because I literally descend from West Africans on both of my sides, both my paternal and maternal sides, that my ancestors literally had systems in place where they can own, buy, and trade slaves. It was already established prior to any European intervention. Prior to the Iberians getting there, the Dutch, before anybody getting the English, getting involved in West African politics, before any of that took place, there was already a system of slavery going on by the natives and indigenous autochthonous people of the western coast of Africa. So this distortment doesn't make any sense. And it's just a way to try to make yourself feel better about your ancestry, or make white people out to be, oh, they're the ultimate sinners. And, we were just these God-fearing monks that lived in West Africa, not bothering nobody. No, first of all, we were warmongers. We were very greedy, and a lot of avarice took place. This is why slavery happened. This was the impetus of the slave trade. The impetus of the slave trade was the fact that we had African chieftains and kingdoms and sets that, would do anything for resources and money, to the point where they monopolized the trade. Right? They controlled and dominated the trade. Without those Africans on the west coast of Africa, there would not be a transatlantic slave trade. It would not have transpired that way because there would not have been the resource, which would be the slaves being sold in bulk without them. And, you know, a lot of people were like, I don't want to claim an ancestry, you know, because we speak about DNA a lot. And I do want to write a book. No, it doesn't have anything to do with Israelite ancestry. I'm done with that. It's going to be titled, Who Are the Ancestors of the African Americans? That's the book I want to work on because we need to clear that up. Because when we discuss ancestry, the minute you have a non-African marker, now it's an issue. You're like, oh, I don't want to be a descendant of a raper or someone who committed sexual assault. Okay, well, West Africans having African ancestry does not clear you of that because they do all those things plus more. They have a history of doing all those things plus more. I don't want to have descent from slavers. That was big business in West Africa. Do slave raids. You will have people create canoes so they can go up and down the coast trading slaves, going inland and trading slaves. And not only traded slaves, when they traded slaves, they would floss the goods that they had and wear and rock the goods. What we're about to get into tonight, or today, excuse me, it is very telling of the history. And you're not going to get this from Umar Johnson. You're not going to get this from Professor James Small. You're not going to get this from Sodnet TV. You're not going to get it from these Afrocentric channels. You're not going to get it from them because it does not look good. And the whole idea of when we're dealing with Africanity, you always want to look good. You always want to dress it up to make it seem as if these people were just harmonious people living very prosperous lives, you know, praying to God and just being these wholesome peoples. And that's not true. The history of humanity is not like that. You got the good, bad, you got the evil, you got all that. So y'all got to get that idea of this pure, way of living that these Africans were living. No, they were not. They were very dubious and very nefarious. They would sell their own children. They would pawn their own children. They would do all type of wicked and vile things. They would go capture their neighbors. They would capture their friends. They would take them and sell them to the traders. They would do that. Right? They would falsely accuse you of witchcraft so they can put you into their system of slavery that already existed prior to European contact. West Africans, my ancestors, would enslave you if you committed a crime like witchcraft. If you committed adultery, if you committed these different things, you are susceptible to being enslaved. The West Africans had plantations, they had maids, they had all that prior to that. You don't have to dress this history up. It is what it is. There's a lot of dirt that was done on the west coast of Africa, and that dirt is the reason why we have the transatlantic slave trade. Without the West African component, you don't have it, because the people that supplied the bulk of the slaves are the West African traders, right? And these different kingdoms that were coming to, they were coming to they were coming into their own during this time. They were growing, coming to fruition, and as they expand, they took on the other kingdoms surrounding people around them, enslaving them, defeating them, destroying them, taking them to the coast and trading them as slaves. They showed you this in The Woman King, but they tried to dress it up at the end, saying, "Oh, we're selling our own." They didn't care about that. It all came down to making that money. Making that money, getting those resources, getting guns, getting gunpowder, getting that liquor and tobacco. Let's be honest, these Africans were selling each other or selling other tribes, rival gangs, whatever you want to call it, to get high, to get fucked up, to get drunk and smoked and all the other stuff. That's the history. And again, you're not going to hear this from no Umar Johnson, none of these Afrocentric, these people that praise Africanity all day. You're not going to hear this from no Jabari. You're not going to hear this from them. They always want to condemn slavery, but the root of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, is the system that already existed in the west coast of Africa. The idea of penyaring, the idea of being able to come and take people and enslave them for several reasons. Or just because you become a commodity, you become a ward of the state after I take down your chieftain. After I take down your kingdom, take down your tribe, all of y'all belong to us. And we can do to you as we please. That's West African history. No one wants to bring it up because there's no victimhood there. You can't play the victim role. See, in America, y'all want to play the victim role. Everybody want to play the victim. Everybody want to be a victim. But our history is more complex than that. If there were not African traders, there would not be African slaves. The Europeans had to bow down and kowtow to the African rulers of the west coast of Africa, of the Gold Coast, the Windward Coast. They had to bow down to their wishes to the point where the Africans like, listen, we're going to give you this tainted. They were giving them gold, but it was tainted. They were trading with gold. Hey, take this money. It had copper in it. It was adulterated. It wasn't pure gold. But what? The Europeans had to, hey, if we want slaves, we have to bow down to the negotiations. And the Africans was getting violent with the Europeans. Hey, come on, man. We're gonna get into this tonight, man. We're gonna get into this tonight, man. They were busting Europeans upside the head, killing Europeans if they did not bow down to their wants and their demands to keep the slave trade going. Y'all don't hear me. Y'all don't hear me, though. Y'all don't hear me. Y'all want that lovey-dovey version of African history. Y'all don't want to deal with the real. You know, you guys really want censorship. I'm going to be honest with you. You want to censor all this stuff because, again, you can't push these narratives. You can't push the narrative that, oh, woe is me. We were just chilling. We wasn't bothering nobody. We was very peaceful. First of all, the West African history is very warlike within itself. You want to go to the Middle Ages, you want to go before that, you want to go to the Stone Age. It's very warlike. People dominating, taking over, and expanding. That's most of West African history. You're talking about a history of people expanding and reducing other populations. So we get to the modern era, when we get to the age of colonialism, same thing was going on. And that's what we're going to read today. You're going to learn here on Genesis 49ers. And I will be setting up my backup channel because, again, I did get hit with a strike and I was not able to upload for quite some time. And to mitigate that, I'm going to create my backup channel. It's going to be called the Sub-Saharan African Network. So you guys look out for that in the future. That channel will be up and running. And that will be my backup channel. And I'll start live streaming and putting clips up on that channel to give you guys some content there just in case they finally 86 this channel, because I got 2 more strikes before they can do that. And there's people that watch us that just hate watch and would love to see this channel go away. So I have to make provisions to create a backup channel. But anyway, with that being said, look out for Sub-Saharan Network. Sub-Saharan Network on YouTube. That will be my next endeavor here. Ezra says similar to other places. Yeah, exactly. In the Americas, the same thing happened. During the period of colonialism, you had tribes that were warring with each other. They already had slavery going on. They already had the concept going on. And they started selling their slaves to the Europeans. Same thing. Anyway, so we will be getting into the source material. I know people, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. Just like when you find out your DNA from Europe, I don't want to accept that. It is what it is. You can't change your DNA. You can't change what happened in history. This is the historical record. This is what took place. Trying to cover it up and dress it up, try to make it look good is just silly. Y'all really are for censorship, man. Y'all want to censor this and blot it out of history, but this is the case. You don't have African traders, you don't have the transatlantic slave trade. It's that simple. There was no mass invasion that took place in the west coast of Africa where thousands and thousands and thousands of families were snatched by Europeans. The people that were doing the snatching were the slave raiders, and the slave raiders were Africans. All the Europeans did was set up dock on the coast and wait for the traders to come and do business with them. Their slave ships would sit on the coast, wait on them. They would come with the slaves, and they kept those slave roads filled. The Africans kept the slave markets filled with slaves from neighboring territories, from inland, and sometimes their own kids, because they would pawn their children off. This is a indigenous West African practice to pawn your children off to pay off debts. So they will go to these traders, say, give me some rum, give me some gunpowder. All right, how would you like to pay with this? Well, I don't have any money. I'm going to give you my children. I'm going to give you my son. I'm going to give you my daughter. I'm going to pawn my daughter off to you. And they be like, okay, you pawn your daughter, you pawn your children, your son or whatever. You pawn them. And then you be like, all right, I'm going to get the money I owe you. I'm going to get the gold or whatever that I owe you in exchange. And I'm going to come back in exchange for my children. But a lot of times, they wouldn't exchange for their children. And what the Europeans would do would take those children and go ahead and sell them to the Caribbean. That's y'all talking about, y'all don't want to descend from a slave trader. Yeah, you are. You descended directly from a slave trader. Your own parents. Nobody was safe. Nobody was safe. Your own parents will do you one, man. And that is an indigenous West African practice, to pawn your own children or pawn your relatives for a debt you owe. That's an indigenous West African practice, man. I don't know what to tell you. And we're going to get into that. The book we're going to be digging in today are where the Negroes are masters. Where the Negroes are masters. And pretty much the title implies that these people pretty much controlled their own destiny. They controlled and fostered the trade that we know as the transatlantic slave trade. Key part, a key component to the slave trade. Without that, you have no slaves. You have no resources for the damn slave trade. You don't have it. Right? So all this trying to victim, I'm a victim and everything is bad because and I'm going to show you that was an excuse that these slave traders were trying to make back then. The same shit y'all be saying today is an excuse they were trying to make back then, to try to cover up the dirt that they've been doing for centuries. That's human history, though. Human history is not clean and pristine. Human history is dirty. Like the idiom goes, our righteousness is but filthy rags. That's true. We all done dirt. We've all done evil things. We've all conducted ourselves in a way that is not pleasurable, right? That ends up in chaos. We've all done it. There's no person clean on this earth when we're talking about ancestry and human population in general. Wars have happened, raids have happened, people have been enslaved, killed, violated, sexually assaulted by a multitude of different groups of people. And that's just common history. But with that being stated, I'm going to do something different for this video. I'm not going to read the entirety of this book to you guys, because I could. It'll take several videos. What I'm going to do, I'm going to open up with the conclusion. Then I'm going to go to 2 chapters that I think that are most important in this book that I want to reveal to you guys. So that's how we're going to rock today. Remember, ain't no future in your front. We ain't got a front about this. Because I was told when they find out they're European, I don't want to be a descendant of a slaver. I don't want to be a descendant of someone that committed SA and all this other stuff. But West Africans are doing the same thing. So you don't want to be a descendant of nobody. And then slavery didn't even stop. Just on the west coast of Africa, when you get to the Americas, you have free blacks that were continuing to own slaves and fight for slaves. Many of them fought in the Civil War on the Confederate side because they believed in the right to own slaves. This is part of history you guys you either don't learn or you guys skip over. And a lot of the reason why people don't learn about it because it's not pleasant. They want to censor history. That's why y'all always try to throw things on other people that y'all do. Oh, they censoring and cover up the history. No, that's what y'all doing. You know? Come on, man. So this is where the Negroes are masters in African port in the era of the slave trade, page 252. I want to deal with the conclusion. I'm going to backtrack. So the Anomabo grew into one of the hubs of Atlantic commerce, comparable in size to its Atlantic sister ports, Charleston, South Carolina, Newport, Rhode Island. So real quick, let me show y'all this port real quick. The Anomabo. There's a town in Ghana. Let me go, let me type in map real quick so we know where we at. Get a good picture real quick for you guys. Real quick. So I just want to give you guys a visual of what part of the world this is, because you know. All right, here's a great one right here. Open image, new tab. Well, so as you can see, and the Anomabo port is on the western coast of Africa in the Gold Coast in modern day Ghana. This is where it's located. This is the area that we're discussing here in today's video for everyone watching. Now you got a visual. You know this is in Western Africa. Okay, so let's go back to the book. Anomabo grew into one of the hubs of Atlantic commerce comparable in size to its Atlantic sister ports, Charleston, South Carolina, and Newport, Rhode Island. Its capable and crafty merchants relied on the exportation of mice and slaves and the importation of European goods to build a wealthy, independent, and powerful commercial center. So I'm going to stop right there. We're already learning a lot. This is a port. This is one of the ports. It's one of the major ports in West Africa. And these West Africans, they relied on exportation of mice, which is corn, what we call corn in America, American corn. So they was trading. They would get American corn, and they started growing corn on the west coast of Africa. And they started selling and trading corn themselves, and they started selling slaves, right? And they were importing European goods. And they built a wealthy and independent, powerful commercial center. These are Africans. See, this is not the version of history that you guys got in your head, that there was a European invasion. They came and kidnapped West Africa. That's not what happened. That did not take place. Let me continue reading on. It says the first stage of Anomabo's place in the Atlantic world, the era of the gold trade, began with European contact in the 1430s. It continued until the trade shifted to the traffic in human beings around 1700. Of the changes and innovation that the contact with Europeans and Anomabo's first tentative links to the Atlantic world introduced, three stand out: the introduction of mice, the fort system, and the development of trade languages. The cultivation of mice ushered in a constellation of economic, social, and political changes that reshaped life on the Gold Coast. Mice fostered population growth, territorial expansion, state formation, military conquest, and enslavement. So these people were getting the corn, the mice from America, starting to grow it, and as they were growing it, they were able to feed themselves. They were able to, as we discussed before, agrarian lifestyles do what? They sustain population growth. So they started to expand and get bigger, right? By eating this corn, having that as a subsistence model. And then they had territorial expansion. So territorial expansion, what are you doing? You're eclipsing other people's territory. And they're conquering and taking other people's territory, and they're also enslaving them. Mice fostered population growth, territorial expansion, state formation, military conquest, and enslavement. And all those developments fed on one another through the 18th century. The Portuguese quickly discovered they could not conquer West Africa. I want y'all to hear this part. The Portuguese quickly discovered that they could not conquer West Africa and sought relationships with rulers on the Gold Coast that fostered trade. All right. So here's the thing. Your idea of these mean old Europeans just came out the woodworks, invaded West Africa, as to start snatching people is a farce. They could not do that. They were unable to do that. So they had to salt relationships with the local rulers. It says they innovated the system whereby European powers paid rent. Listen to this. The Europeans paid rent to the local state for the privilege of building a fort as a base for trade. So I got to stop before I keep reading so you guys can understand this. They paid rent to West Africans, right? Well, whoever the regency was in that area, so they can continue to involve themselves in trade. They had to pay rent. This system endured until the early 19th century and shaped the relations between Africans and Europeans on the Gold Coast. That system recognized African sovereignty and power, and the Fonte jealously guarded their independence and consistently reminded Europeans of those realities. The Fonte was letting them know that we're not a vassal state. We have our own sovereignty and our own power, and you have to do what? You're going to have to negotiate. You're going to have to break bread. Keep reading. It says the emergence of a trade language enabled Europeans and Africans to communicate more effectively, an essential component of trade at a time when trust and face-to-face relationships were an important part of commerce and credit. The emergence of shared language also points to cultural changes underway in that narrow band of contact along the West African coast. The second stage in Anobo's Atlantic history began with the shift from gold to the slave trade. So long as the primary article of the trade was gold, then the interior states enjoyed the economic advantage. But the balance of economic power shifted toward the coastal states with the rise of the slave trade. Anomabo grew from a small dependent town to an independent polity. It controlled a rich interior hinterland where its productive mice plantations worked by enslaved laborers. I want y'all to hone in on that, key in on that. They had plantations in West Africa that was being worked by slaves. All right, it's not an exclusive concept to the Americas or in Europe or something. This was going on in West Africa. They need somebody to grow that damn corn because that corn was very lucrative. It says work by slave laborers contributed to its economic growth and made it an essential stop for slave ships before they embarked on the Middle Passage. Anomabo and its wealthy and capable caboceers played an increasingly important role in the growing Fonte Confederacy. Anomabo's chief caboceer at the height of his power, John Corrante, acted as a major merchant, a military commander, a local ruler, a magistrate, and one of the leaders of the state. He helped guide the town as it expanded its economic and military power and played the rival European nations off one another. He was a leader of the Confederacy when it conquered its neighbors, integrated them into the Confederacy, and successfully countered the rising power of the Asante state. And we already know the Asante states, as they expanded, they began to sell slaves, and a lot of the sources of the slaves came through the Asante. It says here, a close examination of the conduct of the trade on the Anomabo also reveals the inner workings of the Royal African Company and its successor, the Company of Merchants Trading to Africa. As one of the primary engines driving the movement of goods, people, and ideas around the Atlantic world, it is vital that its functioning be well understood, because Anomabo was the primary market on the Gold Coast. Its relationship with the RAC, the Royal African Company, and the CMTA is especially significant. Initially envisioned as a trading company with a strict monopoly on the African trade, The RAC evolved into an organization intended to foster and protect an open trade, but the RAC and the CMTA officials on the coast often exploited the system for their own personal advantage. Their distance from the metropole enabled them to construct a trade network extending around the Atlantic world that worked more to their advantage than to anyone else's benefit. Anomabo's leaders refused to accept the restrictions of a monopoly and maintain their right to trade with all commerce. While they allowed the RAC to build a fort at Anomabo, they maintained their superiority over it, forced the RAC to change personnel and practices to suit them, and maintain their political and economic independence. In 1753, Thomas Melville, governor of Cape Coast Castle, recognized that reality when he referred to the Anomabo as a place where the Negroes are masters. So again, that's the title of the book. That's where the title of the book came from. This actual statement from Thomas Melville. Like, look, they run that down there. You got to go and play by their terms, man. You got to play ball, and you got to do it within their parameters. That's what that means. Where the Negroes are masters, right? Continue to read. It says the end of the RAC's monopoly and often troubled relationship between the town and the RAC resulted in the fort's closing. But Corrante recognized the advantages of having a fort in the Anomabo for himself, for his family, and for the growth of the trade there. The existence of the forts brought significant changes into the town, none more important than the personal relationships between the men in the forts and the women of the town that resulted in a mixed race population that played an important role in the social, cultural, and economic life of the town. Now, I want to just make quick commentary on this as well. There's a lot of people that have European ancestry that are African American, they bothered and perturbed by it or whatever. This is what was going on the west coast of Africa. You have Europeans coming in, learning language, learning culture, and then starting to admix with the women, like your Luso-Africans, Luso meaning Portuguese-speaking Africans. They came from mixed races. And they themselves, I was going to read earlier, they would have children, and then they would do as the other people do in the land and pawn off their children or sell their children into slavery as well. So if you got a European market, you could be a result of this. You know what I'm saying? As well, because again, in West Africa, you did have European admixture during the slave trade in these forts in these cities as well. Continue to read on. And also, just real quick side note on the role in social and cultural economic life of the town. This is why I always say this is completely off topic, but I have to say this. This is why I say mixing into other cultures is vital, especially when you have a negative culture. You can mix into a culture that they got their shit together already, and integrate yourself or integrate your children and your progeny later on into a better culture that's more conducive for their future. I have to say that because a lot of people are anti-miscegenation. They're rednecks, so they in thinking and the way they live, and that's really going to stunt people's growth. But anyway, back to this. It says, while many RAC and CMTA officials spent only a few years on the coast with the intention of getting out as quickly as possible, Richard Brew put down deep roots in the town and played an important role in it. He manipulated his position as a chief of Anomabo fort to his own personal advantage, and when forced out of the organization, he settled permanently in the town, allied himself through marriage to John Corrante, and used his deep understanding of the RAC, the CMTA, the slave trade, and Fonte culture to build a major slave trading empire on the Gold Coast. His trade networks spread around the Atlantic world, and his political intrigues helped shape the relationship between the British and the Fonte. The relationship between the Fonte and the Asante and the British policy toward the RAC and the CMTA. And as we're going to read, the Fonte and the Asante will always bump their heads. They would try to come in and pretty much create peace to continue to trade, because every time these two factions would bump heads, like trade would go to a halt, like slaves would go to a halt. So it was in their interest to keep these two factions from fighting each other. Anomabo's role as the chief market on the Gold Coast comes into sharper focus by tracing the conduct of the trade with New England's rummen, who played an increasingly important role in the economic life of the town as the 18th century progressed. Their trade was emblematic of Atlantic commerce and its long reach. They carried molasses from the Caribbean to their distilleries, where it was used to produce rum, which became the liquor of choice on the Gold Coast and enabled them to gain larger and larger share of the market there. From the and I just can't emphasize this enough. This part right here enough. People were selling swaths of slaves to get fucked up, to get drunk, or just sell the damn rum themselves. Like that's reality. I know it sucks, but that's the truth. It says here, from the fitting of a ship to the hiring of a captain and crew, to the acquisition of the enslaved cargo, to the management of that cargo and crew, to the middle passage, to the determination of the most profitable point of sale, these voyages were extremely complex, risky, and dangerous. Ever attuned to changes in the market, Brew capitalized on the rum men's growing clout and nurtured relationships with them. The slave trade became a vital part of the New England economy, and the rum men helped supply the hungry markets of the southern colonies where cargoes of Anomabo slaves were highly valued. That trade connected the node to the Atlantic world. The Anomabo, Newport, Kingston, Charleston, and defined an Atlantic economy and culture. While it's extremely difficult to trace individuals caught up in the slave trade from their homes in Africa to new homes in the Americas, following individual ships from New England to the Gold Coast to Charleston does provide some very specific indications of what that journey meant for the multitude of victims. Far more Africans crossed the Atlantic in the 18th century than those from Europe or the Americas, and their degradation, enslavement, and brutal deaths continued to haunt the world they built and the world they left behind. For the overwhelming majority of Africans, the voyage across the Atlantic was one of no return, but some Africans from Anomabo escaped enslavement with the help of their families and communities and returned home again. Other residents of Anomabo traveled the Atlantic as sailors. Others were sent to Europe to learn trades. Some members of the elite traveled to America and to Britain to be educated, and the other elites traveled to the capitals of Europe on diplomatic missions. Again, this part of West African history is not taught. They're not going to teach you. James Small ain't going to teach you this. You're not going to get a segment on Saturday TV about this. Umar Johnson ain't going to tell you about this. These Africans would go learn trades in America. They would go freely travel to Europe off the backs of the slave trade. And he's not going to tell you about that. The aristocracy there were well educated, well learned, and they would go and travel to other places and get accustomed to that lifestyle or language or culture. Anyway, it says, while historians have characterized Africans as the least knowledgeable of the Atlantic world citizens, that view must be revised to take into account the efforts Africans, I want y'all to hear this, the efforts Africans made to understand that world and their firsthand experience of it. Those former slaves, travelers, sailors, students, and diplomats were cultural brokers whose experiences shaped their town's collective understanding of the Atlantic world. They learned trades. They learned to read and write in English. They joined churches. They walked the streets of Liverpool, London, and Paris, and they met princes and kings. And doing so, they also impacted the cultures of those faraway places. In some cases, powerful ideas ricocheted around the Atlantic basin. The ideals of liberty growing out of the American Revolution fired minds from Philadelphia to London, from Port-au-Prince to Anomabo. Religious ideas, too, moved from Africa to the Americas and from Europe to Africa. Most pieces of legislation enacted in the capitals of Europe did not reverberate around the Atlantic world, but in some cases, a string plucked in London sounded everywhere the Atlantic touched. The abolition of the slave trade was one act that revolutionized the Atlantic world in ways no one anticipated. All of these currents and more besides found their way to the Anomabo road. By the late 18th century, there were signs of stress in Anomabo as the era of slave trade came to an end. Some of those stresses resulted from the economic troubles brought about by the American Revolution, which had a negative impact on the slave trade. Those hard economic times affected traders like Richard Brew, who faced serious economic problems and whose death marked the end of the empire, despite the efforts of Horatio Smith to revive it. Tensions flared in the Anomabo between the townspeople and between the town and the fort, tensions that resulted in violence and deaths. The abolition of the slave trade by Great Britain and the United States in 1807 and 1808 marked a major turning point in the town's history. Combined with devastating Asante's invasions in 1807, the Anomabo faced body blows from which it never fully recovered. The town lost 2/3 of its inhabitants in war, and its rich hinterland were depopulated and devastated. With the loss of the slave trade, the Anomabo had no means of recovery and its economic life ground to a halt. Without the slave ships and the need for slave provisions, the town's role as an important Atlantic port vanished. The fort had once been used to promote the trade, was now used to suppress it, and the townspeople were too broken to resist. Individuals like Sam Brew did resist, and Brew played a remarkable game as he engaged in the illegal slave trade, ingratiated himself with the Asante, acted as their connection to European and American slave traders, and became a major player in the diplomatic negotiations between the British and the Asante. He lost his life in that game, but through him, the contours of the next phase in history of the slave trade in the history of the British Infante can be discerned, though that story lies beyond the scope of this book. Anomabo lost its place as one of the hubs of Atlantic economy after 1807. Today, the town is far removed from the busy 18th century port it once was. Much of that history remains, though much has been forgotten. The impressive fort still stands. Until recently, it served as a prison, but today the town hopes to make it a centerpiece of a tourist economy. That effort has moved slowly. In 2011, only 54 people signed the fort's guest book compared to the 64,000 who visited the better-known Cape Coast Castle just a few miles away. The Dutch Lodge, or the Almahez Palace, once occupied by John Corrante, still stands and is still occupied by the current holder of that office who claims descent from Corrante. Even Castle Bruce still stands, though today it is known as Aban Kakarba, or Little Fort, and its builder is largely forgotten in Anomabo today. So I wanted to give you guys the conclusion of the book. This is a taste of what's going on. We learned that the power and sovereignty of these African nations, the wars that would lead into the slave trade, slave raids, and the corn, and how the corn was able to foster and build and grow and expand this nation to the point where they're becoming the ruling clan here, or one of the ruling clans, leading into the slave trade. So now we want to get into the chapters. I just want to make this quick note. We brought this out in prior episodes, that after slavery ended, they still were engaging in the illegal slave trade. We just read. They still were selling slaves. They were still doing it illegally under the British nose. And as you can see, the Asante was involved because the Fonte had already been defeated at this point. But with that being stated, let's go. Which one should I go to? The process of enslavement or the first? Let's deal with the process of enslavement at the Anomabo. When Africans were sold, so we're going to chapter 4 right now. When Africans were sold and loaded onto the European ships lying at the anchor in Anomabo Road, that sale marked the end of the African process of the enslavement. And this is what most people deal with, this portion right here, when the Africans actually sold and boards the slave ship, not the process of how they even became slaves in the first place, where they came from. We don't even deal with that. A lot of popular media, movies, and stuff of that nature, they primarily focus on being sold on the coast, getting loaded on the ship, and never seeing their families again, and being torn apart and whatnot. But how did they get to that point? How did they get bounded? How did they get? Why are they a commodity? Why are they slaves in the first place? Why are they even in the market? Why is this question not, going through your head as you see media pieces like this? I mean, it's common sense. They didn't just wake up one day and then, magically became slaves. There's actually a process behind this, and that's what we're about to read. It says a process that often began months before and hundreds of miles from the Anomabo. The town was the primary export center for enslaved Africans on the Gold Coast, and hundreds of thousands of captives left there during the 18th century. Those numbers beg the question of where those men, women, and children came from, how they were enslaved, and how they were sold. The answers to these questions are essential if we are to fully understand the process of enslavement, a process that began long before the slaves were actually purchased by a European captain. So before European involvement, the ball is already starting. We're dealing at the tail end of it when we're going straight to they're getting on the ships, they got sold. For the majority of captives sold in the Anomabo, their enslavement began as a result of their capture and wars fought deep in the interior. Their enslavement was often accompanied by the defeat of their nation and the destruction of their homes and communities, and their shock and loss is evident in the descriptions captains left of them. These men and women and children were often ignorant of the fate that awaited them. A substantial portion of the captives were residents of the coastal states who were convicted of crime or sold for debt. These individuals knew very well the fate that awaited them in the plantation societies of the Americas. Others, especially children, were kidnapped, stolen, and spirited away before their families even knew they were gone. So, real quick, just to recapitulate what we just read, many of these slaves were coming through the way of wars. So, if a war had the Fonte would war against a neighboring kingdom or a kingdom that's hinterland, they would take them down, take their women, take their children, take their men, and forcibly bring them to these ports. That's one method. The other method was within their own society. If someone committed a crime like adultery, various witchcraft of that nature, they would imprison them, and instead of sentencing that person to death, it would sentence them to slavery. That's another source. Or someone owed a debt, they would sell their relatives, their children, as I brought up earlier, to pay that debt. And then the third one was just straight up kidnapping. And that goes back to your slave raids. We talked about the whole slave raiders that would come in and snatch people. And what happened is, like, this became such a common practice in West Africa. I think West Africa was utopic. It's a utopia, that these people just living all fine and dandy and everybody was happy and rejoicing. That slave raiding became so popular at some point that they started to make bombardments around their home to keep people from running in and snatching them and snatching their kids and snatching their peoples, man. So these are the sources of slavery. See, we always jump to the part, oh, they on the coast, they on the slave ship, the European made the purchase. But how did they get to the damn ports? How did they get to the slave market? That's the question you should have been asking yourself this whole time. Africans are the reason why. Other Africans, capturing Africans, kidnapping them, warring with them, conquering them is the answer. Anyway, it says these individuals found their way to the Anomabo market along different routes and illustrate how the experience of enslavement varied considerably for its victims. It is also important to recognize that the process by which slaves were marketed varied considerably from one African nation to another. At Anomabo, slaves were sold by the fort and by Fonte merchants, by small-time bush traders with one slave to sell, by brokers from the interior with coffles of slaves, and by Fonte merchants who bought them from the inland markets. Criminals and debtors were sold after being convicted by the courts. The trade with Europeans was supported by the credit system of pawning, whereby merchants used their own children as collateral to access the credit they needed from their European trading partners to purchase slaves. So I'm going to read that again. As a system of pawning, whereby merchants used their own children as collateral to access the credit they needed from their European trading partners to purchase slaves. They would put their own children up as collateral. It says in all cases, slave sales were supervised by gold takers who made up a substantial portion of the town's population and acted as agents and brokers for every sale. Their role in the process of enslavement at Anomabo was a critical one. The other major players were, of course, the ship captains who brought the trade goods to exchange for the captives, and it was the captains who made the final decisions on which captives would embark on the Middle Passage. While historians have debated where the slaves sold from the Gold Coast originated, contemporaries agree that the great majority were war captives supplied by the Asante from the interior. In 1789, the British Parliament opened an investigation into the conduct of the slave trade, and that provides a rich means to examine the conduct of the slave trade in the Anomabo and on the Gold Coast. Among the captains and company officials who appeared before the committee was Richard Miles, the CMTA officer, who lived on the Gold Coast from 1765 to 1784, and whose brothers who were also engaged in the trade. No one understood its workings better than he did. When asked where the supply of slaves came from, Miles reported that, open quote, Fontes on the water side provide near 1/4 of the slaves purchased by us on the Gold Coast. The other 3/4 from the inland believes the whole from 7 to 8,000. So again, the Fonte people provided a bulk of the slaves here. These are West African peoples, right? That's close quote right there. His insight helps answers one of the most important questions surrounding the trade. Miles, like other Europeans on the Gold Coast, suggested that the major source of supply was trade with the interior, and other evidence supports his claim. CMTA officials on the coast, along with captains of slave ships experienced in the trade, agreed that the vast majority of slaves sold on the Gold Coast came from hundreds of miles inland and were drawn from many different nations. As Jerome Bernard Wavis, a company official on the coast, reported, open quote, brokers go from 100 to 150 miles up the country to pursue them. Then from what further distance they may be brought, it is impossible to say, but it's probable they come from a very great distance and from different countries, for they talk different languages. So again, these traders would go deep into the hinterlands of the coast. They would go deep into the hinterland. They would go grab and purchase these slaves, or do it through war, or do it through trading, and then bring these slaves back to the coast to be sold to European merchants. And these people just scrambled up and jumbled together because they spoke different languages. They didn't all come from the same villages, same cultural backgrounds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is why you can't. This is another issue. There is no homogeny here with slavery, right? It's not all the same people. It's not all the same groups, especially when you look at the genetic level. Some slaves would have RV88, some slaves would be E1, B1A, some slaves would be A, B, some slaves would have other R1B claim, right? Some slaves could have T. These are a mixed bag of people that they're just grabbing to supply the market and the demand for that market. All right, continue. It goes on to say, read, those contemporary sources also agree that most of the slaves sold on the Gold Coast were prisoners of war. The 18th century was a period of turmoil and almost continual conflict on the Gold Coast, and military incidents took place in at least 43 of the 65 years between 1700 and 1765. In the early decades of the 18th century, a series of wars, either between the Asante and the coastal states, or between coastal states, provided most of the captives sold at the Anomabo. Between 1701 and 1721, the Asante fought wars with a number of smaller nations in the Gold Coast region: the Asin, the Dakera, the Warsaw, the Kufero, the Awanweye, and the Amanahia. While wars often interrupted the trade during the conflict itself, the end of the war usually brought a flood of war captives onto the slave market. Sometimes the connection between inland wars and increased supply of slaves to European forts is clear and compelling. In December 1721, for example, the RAC officials observed that, open quote, slaves are likely to come down to the coast in plenty from the battle said to be lately fought by the Ashantis, in which they have got the victory, close quote. Slave exports indeed rose from an estimated 450 in 1721 to an estimated 1,180 the following year, when the Asante were coming often to the coast to trade, an increase that can be attributed to that conflict. So again, they would go on these war parties. They would go ravish, defeat the enemy. After they defeat, they go and take them, the people conquered, as slaves, and bring them back to the coast to be sold. This is why I titled this video, Africans Played the Biggest Role in the Slave Trade. Without these Africans actively doing this, there will be no resource for the slave trade. There would not be any slaves to trade. It's just that simple. All right, let me keep reading. There were big spikes in the trade from the Anomabo from 1730 to 1732 when the Akwambo, or Akwamu, was defeated by the Akim. A supply of slaves so great that Europeans claimed they could buy a slave for a bottle of brandy. The 1740s and 1750s saw another spike in the trade from the Anomabo, which corresponded with a major Asante campaign against the Akim, the Akwambu, the Ganja, and the Dagomba. Even after these nations were conquered, it often took far longer to actually subdue them. In some cases, guerrilla wars continued for some time, and raiders preyed on merchants traveling along the paths and roads. For this reason, the victors in these wars often prevented their opponents from regrouping by enslaving and selling off as much of the population as possible, a practice known as eating the country. I want y'all to hear that again. I want y'all to hear, because this idea, this Walt Disney version of slavery and transatlantic slave trade in your mind has to be eradicated and eroded. This is what was actually going on. In these wars, the victors in these wars often prevented their opponents from regrouping by enslaving and selling off as much of the population as possible. A practice known as eating the country. So to prevent you from regrouping, getting back together, and probably doing a counterattack on us, we're just going to take as many of y'all as we can, take you to the coast, take you to the port, and sell you off to these European merchants to be sold into the Americas. Therefore, you don't have a soldier or a front no more. You have nothing to fight with anymore. And above, you can see a call for enslaved men and women and child being marched from the interior to the coast. They are bound at their necks so they can walk more easily. And that's the image you see above. And to the right, you see an image of a major military campaign of the Asante Kingdom in the 18th century. As you can see, they were getting busy. All those arrows that you see here on your screen, yeah, that's them getting busy, man. That's their military campaigns going throughout the hinterland or inland of this region now known as Ghana, and going and taking slaves. That's what you're looking at to the right here. They will bring them back to the Anomabo coast to be sold. It says here, but it was wars fought by the Asante along their interior borders during that great expansion in the 18th century that kept the supply of slaves flowing to the Anomabo. These interior wars were longer and generally spread over a larger area than those along the coast itself. This long series of wars was not driven by the slave trade per se, though the two were closely intertwined. The Asante sold slaves in part to replenish their supplies of guns, powder, and shot, which could be acquired only from Europeans on the coast. The accessibility of guns for the nations on or near the coast is one reason that the Asante had a more difficult time subduing those states as opposed to those nations on their interior borders. So, real quick, this is common sense. The people that's inside in the interior, they don't got guns. So we gonna go take them down, kill them, and enslave them. Because if we do that on the coast, they got guns because they got the access to the same traders and European merchants as us. So they took the path of least resistance. The people inland, they don't have these resources, they can't defend themselves properly. So we're gonna come in, set up shop, wreck shop, take them, sell them. People on the coast, they own them to the teeth. We can't really do that to them, right? Or it's gonna be issues. It says right here, the Asante were able to prevent those interior nations from acquiring weapons from the coast and thereby gain a great advantage. The slave trade, in effect, made it possible for the Asante to carry out their conquest, and the gunpowder revolution, as historian Thornton calls it, played a major role in those conflicts. The northern provinces were more easily integrated into the Asante Kingdom than those to the south, where instability continued throughout the 18th century, instability that both fueled and interrupted trade. The Asante determination to keep trade open to the coast by force if necessary resulted in an agreement between the Wassa, the Twifo, the Nigeria, and the Akim to make peace with the Asante and to keep the paths open. In 1753, representatives of these states traveled to Kumasi and swore to such an agreement. The results were dramatic. as the number of slaves sold at the Anomabo jumped from an estimated 1,768 in 1752 to 4,208 in 1753 and 4,483 in 1754. But these coastal nations chafed under Asante rule and periodically challenged their overlords. As a result of this continued resistance, the Asante prepared to launch a major expedition against the Wassa and the Akyem in 1764. News that was warmly greeted from London to Newport to Boston, since the Atlantic slave traders knew that the result would rise in the supply and a drop in the price for slaves. So, these Europeans, they anticipated when they went to war because they knew more slaves and at a cheaper price that they could get them at, right? It's sad, but this is the reality of what was going on during that time. Knowing that war would bring a flood of slaves to the markets, the Fonte agreed in 1765 to allow the Osequado, the Asante Hene, to establish a military base in their territory from which to launch renewed attacks against both the Wassa and the Akyem. William Mother wrote the African Committee in 1765 that the Asante were at war with the Akyem and had surrounded the Akyem. He reported that the Fonte army was encamped nearby, intent on plundering the loser. So what does that mean? What does that part right there mean? Classroom participation. Plundering the loser. They're gonna whoever loses, they ass is grand. They're going into slavery. So they sat back and waited. Like, all right, when they done, whoever dropped, we taking them. We taking them in. We're finna go make this money. Finna go turn this in for rum, guns, tobacco, you know what I'm saying, and all that good jazz. The Asante went on to defeat the Akyem and got possession of their camp, in which they were all women and children, and the greatest part of their men, to the number about 15 or 20,000 in all. At the same time, the worthy Fontes were very busy pillaging and stealing the Akyems, who were reduced by famine, and they gave themselves up in great numbers to anybody that would promise them victuals, so that slaves became very plentiful among these gentry. And I'm hoping y'all listening, man. I know some people click off the video and don't want to hear this because y'all always want to make this, fanciful Walt Disney Pixar version of history, especially when it comes to Africans. They were harmonious. They lived in a utopic environment. And it's not the case. Again, the Fonte was like, hey, the Asante, y'all can set up in our spot. Y'all can get your little spot. When y'all go to war, we're gonna sit back and just analyze. We ain't gonna get involved. We're gonna sit back and analyze, and whoever drop, we coming in for the kill. We coming in to take what's ours, and we're gonna take these slaves and we're gonna make money out of them. Now we just read 15 to 20,000 of these people were pretty much captured after this, women and children and men. They took them to go be traded for money for goods. For goods. And they said slaves were plentiful among the gentry. Plentiful. They got plenty. They made money off of this. And we're going to read on later that they was flossing. After, you have these gold takers, as we read earlier, coming up draped out in gold, the finest cowrie fringed on their clothes. They couldn't even be bothered by the sun. They had people that they paid people to just stand there and fan them and block the sun with leaves and stuff like that. Come on, bro. These people it was like, listen, we fat cats here. We living rich off of this trade. And they was flaunting it and showing it in people's face. We got money. We rich. And it is what it is. Anyway, that's West African history. That's a part of West African history. It says, in addition, Fonte had captured between 1,200 and 1,500 Asante soldiers who were pillaging the Fonte crooms, towns, and plantations. Mother noted that the price of slaves was dropping because of the influx of Akyem war captives, news that spread from the Atlantic world. The Fonte were holding on to large numbers of Akyem and Fonte captives in hopes of forcing the prices up. One unidentified slave ship captain reported that he purchased 300 of those Asante captives in 8 or 9 days from Richard Brew, a report that was published in London and Newport. Brew knew how to cover all his bases. John Marshall, who made about 20 voyages to the Gold Coast, reported that he was at Anomabo when the Asante and Fonte were at war. The conflict totally interrupted the trade to the point that it took 16 months to slave his ship. But the end of that war brought a flood of captives. He reported that the Fonte took many Asante prisoners, most of whom would have been sold or executed had Brunei intervened and proposed instead to the Ashanti the redemption of those prisoners, which he gladly acceded to. That move, of course, carried favor for Brew with the Ashanti, who was probably unaware that Brew was selling Ashanti prisoners at that same time. The result was very high exports from Anomabo. In fact, 1767, the high point of the trade, when an estimated 7,073 slaves sold from the port in that year. Company officials strove to keep the peace. John Grossley, chief of the Anomabo fort, labored to improve the strained relations between the Fonte and Asante nations. He sent presents to the Asante Osequado, also known as the Osekuma or Kumaha to the British. He gave his gifts to the Ando-Payans, who were trying to negotiate between them. He gave out rum and tobacco to the Anomabo soldiers to induce them to settle the Ashanti business. And he sent messengers and goods to Abra to get the assistance of the leaders of that town to help the Asante and Fonte reach a settlement. It is impossible to say what effect his efforts actually had, but in 1769, Grossley notified the African Committee that a perfect tranquility seems now to reign between the Asante and the Fonte, and as a result, there were several years of very high exports from the Anomabo. Going off, y'all. Excuse that. In 1774, David Mill reported to the AC that there was but very little fear of further disturbance between the Fonte and Asante, and that trade remained open. A year later, the pass was still open, and the mill boasted that more slaves were exported in 1774 than in previous years. And estimates show that he was correct. An estimated 2,352 slaves left Anomabo in 1773 and 6,221 in 1774. Ongoing resistance in the lands that Asante conquered meant that they continued to round up captives in these areas even after the wars were over. Before the British abolition of the slave trade in 1808, lowered prices and demand, the Asante generally insisted that tribute from the conquered territories be paid in the form of slaves. So here you go. Here's another source. Here's another source of slavery. Here's another source of slavery. We already took a bunch of your people when we conquered you because we didn't want y'all to regroup, form a military coup, and destroy us. So we took as many of y'all we could and sold y'all. And even after that, you got to pay tribute to me. And in doing so, you have to do it through the form of slaves. You have to sell your people to me as slaves. Anyway. Another source of the captives sold on the Gold Coast. When disorders broke out in the Gomba, decades after its initial conquest, the Asante reoccupied the region and imposed an annual tribute of 1,000 slaves. These payments may have encouraged tributary states located on the edges of the Asante Empire to mount raids against their neighbors to acquire the slaves rather than enslaving their own people. Those tribute payments provided another steady stream of slaves to the coast. Once the Asante captured and enslaved their enemies, they had to get them to the market by marching them overland along the trade paths. Paths were literally footpaths connected to the towns and villages. And the most efficient means of transportation was by water, but lacking an extensive river system, trade between the coast and the interior ran along these paths. Trade goods, those bulky and heavy bundles and boxes of fabrics, basins, lead bars and guns had to be transported by human effort since, as Jerome Barnard Wavius pointed out, there are no cattle of burden on the Gold Coast and very few bulls and cows. Europeans and African elites preferred to travel by sea, and when they did use these paths, they were carried in hammocks by African porters. And that's the image you see to the right. You can see the hammock, you see the European being carried by African porters. It says William Smith, an Englishman who visited the Gold Coast in the early decades of the 18th century, described the unusual mode of travel. He reported that people are carried in a network hammock fastened at each end of the pole called a bamboo, but the thickness of a man's leg, which a couple stout Negroes can easily carry with a white man in it. They always sit up in the hammock with their legs and feet hanging over one side and leaning their breasts over the bamboo, while the slaves run along by their hammocks holding umbrellas over their heads to guard them from the sun. Henry Meredith, a CMTA official on the coast in the early 19th century, noted that the cotton hammocks were imported from Brazil by the Portuguese and had to travel a distance of 20 miles required 6 or 8 bearers for each hammock. These men relieved one another without stopping, and another 2 or 3 men carried other goods, especially a case of liquor for the people to drink, without which nothing is done in this country. So again, they was getting messed. They was getting fucked up. They were drinking. Like, it seemed like a source of, it was the impetus behind their work and their efforts of doing all this is drinking, right? That's why the rum trade was so important. It says, when well supplied with rum, he estimated that they traveled about 5 miles an hour. He added that 2 or 3 Europeans traveling in this way with the flag of their country carried before them attended a number of stout black men, almost in state of nature, singing and running, making a most whimsical procession. The men were paid in goods of gold to the value of about 5 shillings each for the trip. Again, the title of the video, Africans played the biggest role in the slave trade. Without them, they're integral to it. Without them, there would not be a slave trade. It's that simple. They played the biggest role. They are providing the commodity of the slave trade, the slaves themselves. And we're seeing how this transpired, right? Anyway. Perhaps the oldest of all Asante administrative agencies was one created in the mid-18th century to send out the inspectors to see that the roads and paths of the kingdom were kept open. The regularity of the slave trade along the Asante roads is further indicated by the fact that the king kept a toll collector on the road to collect payments from the black slave traders. The black slave traders, that to be known. One of the Asante Great Roads ran directly from the capital at Kumasi to Anomabo, a route that required 11 stops to cover 125 miles. The heavy traffic along the path indicated the importance of trade between the two, but the primary Fonte foreign policy was to prevent the Asante from gaining direct access to the coast, since that would cut them out as the middlemen in the traffic. In order to prevent that calamity, the Fonte forged alliances with all nations lying between the coast and the Asante. All nations west of the Fonte joined the alliance. The Asante and other inland nations who wanted to sell slaves to the Europeans on the Gold Coast brought them to markets where Fonte brokers acquired them for resale. William Mother observed in 1764 that regular markets had been settled on the borders of the Fonte country, where the Warsaws, Akims, and several others keep up a constant intercourse between the Ashanti and Fonte country. Jerome Bernard Wevis noted that the black brokers told him that they go 3, 4, or 5 days journey to the market inland, to which slaves are brought by more inland brokers, and so from many more inland brokers. Now this means slaves from throughout the Asante nation were funneled to these markets located on the border with the Fonte nation. He rightly judges such slaves to be various tribes. From their different mode of marking their bodies, some filling their teeth, above all their different languages. I see I'm gonna have to move my damn phone. Silence in the sun. Wevis told the committee that he had purchased 20, 30, or 40 who did not know each other's language. Clearly, captives were drawn from far in the interior and from scores of different national and ethnic groups. The vast majority would have been war captives, but Asante and other nations in the interior also sold criminals into slavery. And as we brought up earlier, that was also a source. If you're convicted of a certain crime, instead of being put to death or something like that, you could be sold into slavery. So that became a source of slaves. Again, Africans are integral to the slave trade because they're the ones doing and conducting this part of the business. That we don't see that many media pieces covering. We don't see Umar Johnson. We don't see these figureheads talking about this part of the slave trade. No one talks about this. Anyway, tensions between the Fonte and their neighbors sometimes closed the paths with devastating consequences for the trade. And CMTA officials used all their diplomatic skills to try to keep the paths open to give the Asante better access to the coastal forts. William Mother, the governor of the Cape Coast Castle, wrote his superiors in London in 1764 to report that he had sent 2 messengers to the Asante, and those men returned 4 months later with about 200 Asante traders who brought slaves and gold dust with them. Mother doubted, however, that the pass will remain open due to the quarrels and disturbances which are continually happening in this country. And he claimed the greedy. I want y'all to hear this part too. This is the European man, I believe, that's speaking here now. The greedy and avaricious and villainous disposition of the natives puts it out of every white man's power to keep up a free, uninterrupted intercourse with the inland countries. This is what he's saying about the natives here. They're greedy. That means that you're saying the same thing when you say avaricious, however you say it. Avaricious. It's the same thing as saying greedy. Villainous disposition of the natives. Like these people warn too much. They're battling each other. Why is he bringing up greed? Because one nation wants to control the trade over the other. Like they want all the money. They want all the goods. They want all the things that come from it. So they're warring and battling with each other to gain that control, to gain that monopoly. It says conflicts and disturbance among the Asante and their neighbors, along with the conflict between the Wasa and Akim, threatened to close the path again. He wanted the AC officials to see what an unsettled way of affairs are generally in this country and how little dependence there is either in the opening the paths or keeping them so when they are open. He also noted that the Fonte would plunder the Asante when they could, but Bruce's skillful diplomacy helped establish a peace that endured for many years. That peaceful interlude encouraged the Fonte to allow the Asante to travel through their territory to trade directly with the forts, something the British encouraged. 1775, David Mill, the governor of the Cape Coast Castle, reported that the Asante wanted to open a market near the waterside than before, and Fontes have acquiesced, a move that he saw as being very beneficial to the trade in general. Mill intended to send the best presents he could to find the Asante to encourage the move, but he asked the African Committee to send more lavish gifts, including a large umbrella of crimson damask with gold fringe and gilt elephant on the top to spread 15 feet, a large silver basket sword, and a gold-headed cane with the arms of the company engraved. In 1775, messengers from the Asante received dashes of gifts, including rum, beef, and tobacco from the Anomabo fort when they came to negotiate with the Fonte concerning a free passage for the farmer to the waterside. The 1770s saw great fluctuations in the supply of slaves depending on the relations between the Fonte, the coastal neighbors, and the Asante, and as Mother suggested, the Europeans had little control over those affairs despite their efforts to act as mediators. I just got to bring it out. I got to bring this part out because we had somebody here that's enraged because I'm talking about African, and I don't even know what this dude is. It's like a white person. I don't know who this is. He's enraged. I hope Batman is still listening. I did not write this book. I did not create this history. You understand? The Europeans had little control over those affairs, despite their efforts to act as mediators. Like the Africans played a huge role in this. You just can't ignore it and sweep it under the rug because, we live in this new age of trying to censor every goddamn thing. It is what it is. The next step in the process of enslavement was to get those slaves from the inland markets to the coast. Slaves were brought to the Anomabo by traders from the interior who acquired them at the inland markets and marched them to the coast, or by the Anomabo's brokers who traveled to those markets, or more often sent their employees there. As Miles reported, brokers did not like to keep slaves on hand, but preferred to sell them as quickly as possible to avoid the expense of feeding them and to cut down on the risk of mortality. It was not necessary to confine these men, women, and children. Being from inland, the black broker is not afraid of their deserting. Since they were obviously strangers, they cannot mingle with the local population. These brokers were not just slave traders. They traded other goods as well, especially ivory and slaves. March to the coast frequently carried heavy tusks on their heads. The inland brokers also acted as commission merchants, buying goods on the coast for people in the interior who could not reach the coast themselves. Traders who brought slaves from inland returned with trade goods to the interior. As Captain John Fountain reported, the commodities received by the natives in the exchange for slaves they carry away made up in small bundles upon their heads. Jerome Bernard Wavis reported that brokers were obliged to bring down a number of people to carry back the goods so purchased. And as you can see, male slaves on the Gold Coast chained together by their ankles and necks right there. There's a depiction right there. That was made in 1805. Captives brought from far inland over long distances often suffered great hardships and often arrived on the coast in poor health. In 1715, Asante traders visited the English fort at Comenda to purchase guns and powder, but they brought only gold and ivory to trade, a disappointment to the slave traders there. The Asante reported that they had been recently victorious over the Genegbra, one of their inland enemies, and they had taken many captives and they intended to sell into slavery, but their prisoners were still so very meager and lean that they were not yet able to undergo the fatigue of so far a journey to be vendable when they come here. So again, we're well within this chapter, and we still haven't seen any portion of this chapter revealing that Europeans came in, invaded, and took people. No, what we're seeing is these African polities are going, capturing other tribes, capturing them and forcing them to be slaves. Not only forcing them to be slaves, just to recapitulate, after they force a lot of them to be slaves, they make those nations pay tribute through giving and selling their own people as slaves to them. John Fountain, who came to Gold Coast in 1778 as a soldier and then rose through the ranks to become chief of several of the forts, reported that slaves brought long distance often arrived in general poor flesh, great eruptions over all their skin, very scrofulous, and frequently had bad ulcers. John Adams, a slave trader on the Gold Coast in the late 18th century, described captives from Chamba who were called Duncos by the Fonte and who made the long march from the north of the Asante Empire to be sold on the coast. When they first arrived upon the seacoast, he wrote, they were very meager in consequence of the fatigue experienced by them in a very long journey from the interior, but their constitution being excellent, they are soon restored to their natural vigor and plumpness by rest and plentiful diet. Allowing these captives to remain outdoors to take some exercise rather than keeping them closely confined would have been beneficial to their health and probably explains that practice. Richard Miles estimated approximately 3/4 of the slaves sold in the Anomabo were purchased from the inland markets, while the remaining 1/4 were from the coast. Captain John Marshall estimated that of the slaves brought on the slave Gold Coast, 1/3 may be inhabitants of the coast. The rest are Ashantis and Donkos, who both speak the Fonte language. There were several means by which the Fonte and other coastal people were enslaved and sold off the coast. Some historians have suggested kidnapping was a major source of captives for the Anomabo slave trade. While it seems improbable that an unreliable source like kidnapping could have provided thousands of captives often exported from the Anomabo during a single year, it was certainly an important source of supply of coastal captives. So, real quick, my commentary here. There was a lot of kidnapping going on in west coast of Africa, and it was happening by Africans. It was other African polities coming in and doing it, as we've been reading this entire time. It says even John Corante was accused of kidnapping and selling people from the Anomabo, but such a practice was a dangerous one that could bring severe punishments to anyone convicted of enslaving a free person. The British observed that kidnapping is too dangerous a trade to be commonly followed. Captain James Luttrell suggested that it was usually the poorer traders who take off private families by surprise. These were the men described as bush traders who preyed on children and adults who fell into their hands. An example of this form of capture is provided by Ottobah Pagano, an important African abolitionist in the late 18th century Britain and a friend of Oluta Akiano, author of the best-known slave narrative of the 18th century and the most famous black abolitionist of this day. In 1770, Kugwano, who was about 13 years old at the time, was playing in the woods with a group of friends, gathering fruit and catching birds. Kugwano was born in the coastal Fonte village of Agimake in about 1757, and he was visiting his uncle who lived inland from the coast. After a couple of hours of engaged in their pastimes, several great ruffians suddenly confronted the boys with cutlasses and pistols drawn. They demanded that the boys accompany them, allegedly to meet their overlord to answer for an offense against him. The terrified children were divided and marched through several towns during their journey of several days until they arrived at a town on the coast where Colgano saw his first white man and feared that they would eat him. As the tales he had heard as a child suggested, he was taken into the European castle and dominated the town. And although he did not know the name of the town, it could well have been Anomabo. There he saw other Africans chained 2 by 2, some handcuffed and some with their hands tied behind. He saw his captor take a gun, cloth, and lead in exchange for him, and he joined the prisoners. He was held there for three days until he and many others, including some of the boys who had been captured with him, were loaded onto a ship and taken to the Cape Coast Castle, where they were transferred onto another ship, a slaver bound for Grenada. He saw African merchants coming and going as the ship's hold filled with enslaved Africans, and after several days, the ship sailed out into the Atlantic. So common was that practice that Thomas Trotter, a surgeon on a slaver in 1783, reported that on board his ship during his passage, some of the boy slaves played a game which they called slave taking or bushfighting, showing the different maneuvers thereof and leaping, sallying, and retreating. So again, this form was an integral part of the slave trade, so much so that these European slavers, they would witness the slaves, the boys, playing a game like they're the slave catchers, like they're the people coming out the bushes to kidnap, because that's what they saw and that's what they witnessed, and that's how they got captured. They just started to emulate that in play. That's the crazy part of that. It was necessary for bush traders to spirit their captives away from their homes as quickly as possible before they could be rescued, and to transport them to a slave trading port where a few questions would be asked. The penalties for enslaving a free person were harsh among the Fonte, and anyone convicted of that crime would either be put to death or sold into slavery themselves. As Captain John Fountain told the parliamentary committee investigating the slave trade, a captain never asked a broker how a slave was attained, because the native is aware that if he is found to have come by a slave illegally, he and his family are liable to be sold for the offense. Similarly, Captain Thomas King reported that he had never heard of natives being stolen except from slaves from the inland country. These have mentioned a few being stolen or carried away. Richard Miles agreed. He reported that he did not know he ever heard the word kidnapping mentioned out of his country. It cannot be practiced to any extent without certain detection, for the natives have one general language, and the brokers have daily intercourse with the shipping. Here's a kidnapped slave on board would tell his case to the brokers, who, from interest in regard to the laws, will find the offender. Thomas Trotter painted a somewhat darker picture of kidnapping on the coast that supports Kawano's story. He testified that there were many enslaved boys and girls on the ship who had no relatives on board, and that many of them had been kidnapped in the neighborhood of Anomabo, particularly a girl of about 8 years, who said she had been carried off from her mother by the man who sold her to the ship. He also observed that their gold taker, Fat Sam, who was identified as a person of consequence in the town by CMTA officials, very frequently sent slaves on the board in the night. And Trotter learned that all of them had been kidnapped in the Anomabo neighborhood. Captains refused to pay for slaves that were sold under these circumstances till they had been some time on the board, for fear that they would be reclaimed. Trotter saw one boy who told him that he had been kidnapped from his home in Anomabo vicinity, reclaimed by his family, and rescued from the slave ship. He summed up the view of the many slave ship captains when he remarked that the captain of his ship urged his gold takers daily to get him slaves by any means. Other veterans of the trade suggested that the presence of gold takers on board the ships and their role as intermediaries in the trade served to prevent the kidnapping and sales of locals. But Trotter's testimony suggests otherwise. He pointed out all communication is prevented between slaves on board and the traders, and canoemen who come to sell slaves. Hence, it could not be supposed that any of their connections were informed of their situation. Now we're going to move on to panyaring. We dealt with kidnapping, we dealt with war captives. Y'all learning the major modes of slavery. Y'all learning the major modes of slavery right here. The source of slaves came through war captives, and we've seen kidnapping as well. Now we're going to deal with the practice known as panyaring. So, what is panyaring? Panyaring was probably a more common practice and one that could provide a larger number of captives. To panyar was to seize or capture an enemy by any means other than on the battlefield to obtain redress or restitution. It also meant to kidnap a debtor or his relations to force repayment. So if African traders did not return and redeem their pawns as agreed, European traders could seize any of their townspeople to cover the value of the debt and then demand a palaver or trial to settle the matter. Raiders from states hostile to the Asante, for example, often panyard Asante traders who came near them, captured the traders in their coffers of slaves, and sold all of them into slavery. John Atkins reported in 1735 that the Asante were buying up arms and ammunition in preparation for an attack on Apollonia, provoked by the frequent depredations and panyards of the Apollonians against the Asante traders. Atkins noted that the Fonte were especially guilty of abusing this practice with their neighbors to the point that they had made perpetual enemies on them. Panyaring was endemic along the coast, and its prevalence made it dangerous for traders and travelers who were alone or in small groups. So, just to give a quick summation of what we just read, you had different African groups like the Asante and the Fonte. Anybody traveling them roads, they'll capture them, take them over there, and use this method, panyaring, to sell them into slavery. Very simple and easy to get. Another source of slaves from the coastal region and inland were criminals who were enslaved rather than executed. Richard Miles noted that the coastal people were made slaves for theft, debt, adultery, and witchcraft. He believed that the trials were generally fair, that the judges gained nothing by convictions since convicts were sold for the benefit of the injured, and that judges received a flat fee when suits were brought before them. He noted that he had known thousands of debtors sold for the benefit of the creditors. Trials were held in the town of Palaver's house or the court of justice, where the judges or elders, few under the age of 60 or 70, hear the parties openly for theft and adultery. These respected elders' opinions could be identified by their broad-brimmed straw hats. Only witchcraft trials were held in secret, and in cases of convictions, witches were usually put to death, and their entire families were sold into slavery. In cases other than witchcraft, a conviction did not automatically mean that a person would be sold off the coast. Miles observed that often a convict family would redeem him with a slave before he was sold. So they would provide a slave to exchange for their guilty family member. He noted that most people of consequence owned some slaves from the inland country, and they willingly exchanged those foreigners for their own family members. If they did not own slaves to exchange, then they purchased one from the Europeans if necessary. He reported that a townsman on the coast would go to great lengths to redeem his son. On the coast, it was the poor, the isolated, and the most vulnerable who were in danger of enslavement and sale. The major traders like Brew and Corante had facilities to house slaves awaiting sale, and others were lodged in the fort. While the foreign slaves were not necessarily confined at all times, captives from the coast were men, for example, had their wrists chained to a 25 or 30-pound log to prevent them from escaping. It was this image that haunted Brew when he said that he loved liberty, but he hated logs and chains. At any given time, the Anomabo would have been crowded with slaves and their brokers, but even so, there were seldom enough slaves on hand at any given moment to meet demand. The fort usually kept some slaves in its holds for immediate sale, and major traders like Brew and Corante sometimes did also, but there were never enough slaves to fully supply every ship immediately, which explains why it often took weeks or months to fill a ship's cargo. The next step in the process of enslavement was to sell the captives to the European slavers. Slave ships often crowded Anomabo's road. When a slave ship arrived at the road in a cast anchor, it lay a mile or more from the coast. It was not uncommon to have dozens or 20 ships all competing for slaves at the same time, a situation that drove prices up. The ship fired a salute to alert the Anomabo commissaires that it was ready to initiate trade. Before captains could engage in trade, the chief commissaire sent pinions or other trusted town elders on board the ship to receive custom payments for himself and the other commissaires. Given the importance of the Anomabo trade or as a trading port, it charged the highest customs on the coast. In 1781, every ship that traded there paid 97 pounds in trade goods or 48 pounds sterling to the town. Those rates were so high that some captains tried to avoid the town altogether. Once those payments were made, the ships fired several salutes and hoisted its ensign to show that it was prepared to trade. British merchant ships used the red ensign, a red flag with the Union flag in the canton, which flew under the stern. Soon traders crowded on board, and scarce a day passes afterward. But black brokers come and sleep on board at pleasure to see the trade properly carried on. I mean, at this point, I could stop reading. I mean, it's very evident when I'm showing you guys. Africans played the biggest role. Again, they're the ones capturing the slaves. They're the ones bringing the slaves to the coast. They're brokering these deals. They're creating the demand. They're setting the price and they're resetting the market. They're doing all these things and they're creating the traffic. Without this, you would not have a slave trade. You would not have a transatlantic slave trade. This is vital. This is the root. Anyway, captains could get the lowest prices by buying directly from the Fonte traders. In 1774, for example, Christopher and George Champlain, prominent Newport, Rhode Island traders, advised their brother, Captain Robert Champlain, to make what trade you can with the blacks if you find a black trade brisk so that you may get off in 3 or 4 months. We advise that you finish your trade with them. On the other hand, there were times when buying slaves quickly from the fort was an advantage. 2 years before, the Champlain brothers instructed Captain Samuel Twell and their sloop adventure to sell all the rum you can to the castles on the best terms you can for prime slaves and make all dispatch. They advised him that several other vessels were headed to the coast, and should you tarry till they get down, the chance will be lost. To lay a long time on the coast to piddle with the blacks must be against the voyage. So despite those instructions, the trade was slow. It's well wrote Christopher Champlain from the comfort of the Castle Brew to report that I should do very well if there was any black triad, but there is none. Like all the slave ship owners, the Champlains did their best to predict what the trade conditions might be on the coast and instruct their captains accordingly. But since those conditions often changed, captains had to exercise their own judgment once they arrived at the Anomabo. Captains needed great skill and experience to carry out a successful venture. They had to determine whether to buy from the forts or from the traders or some combination of the two, along with the assessing when, where, and how to sell or trade their goods to the best advantage. And any number of the other challenges could arise on the coast. Captain Champlain reported in 1775 from the Anomabo that he could move his entire cargo of rum if he was prepared to pay the high prices the African traders were demanding. But he informed his employers that he was prepared to spend 3 months on the coast in order to get the best prices possible. It was those substantial differences in price that made trading with Fonte more advantageous, even if it was sometimes more time-consuming and difficult than buying directly from the forts. Rum men like Peleg, Clark, and Champlain also faced the danger of leakage from rum casks. Clark described the plight of the rum man Captain Stanton Hazard, who lost 1/4 part of his cargo due to uncommon leakage. Clark complained that he was having trouble collecting payment from the Dutch at Christiansborg due to troublesome palaver there, and a pawn he was holding had escaped. He mourned the disappointments, crosses, and losses has closely attended us in the voyage. Captains sometimes found that the demands for goods had changed since the time they had loaded their cargoes. John Bell reported from Cape Coast in 1776 that the most commanding articles here at present is rum and tobacco. We keep reading about rum and tobacco, man. It was all about getting fucked up. I'm telling you, they were selling slaves for rum and tobacco. Anyway, he observed that no Portuguese ship had arrived with tobacco for some time, so it was scarce and fetching high prices. He also noted that powder is at present much wanted all along the Gold Coast, many of the beach towns being at war amongst themselves or with the governors. Any of these factors could raise or lower demand and prices for particular goods and determine the success or failure of a voyage. And to the left, you can see a depiction of European traders um, and the African traders smoking the tobacco. And it says an African woman pounding grain. The male slaves are bound by their ankles. In the background canoes carry slaves to the ships anchored in the road. And to the right, you can see more of those canoes filled with slaves being carried into the ships. Again, none of this would be possible or doable at all if the Africans did not play their role here. It says letters went back and forth between captains and their employers, keeping them abreast not only of the events related to their own voyage, but of the most current information about trade conditions on the coast. Merchants used that information to prepare for future voyages. In 1785, the owners of the Boston vessel, probably Joseph Joshua Grafton, instructed their captain, "We shall expect to hear from you by every opportunity to Europe, the West Indies, or any of these United States, and let your letters particularly inform us what you have done, what you are doing, and what you expect to do. We could wish to have a particular information as can be obtained respecting the trade in all its branches on the coast. You will be careful to get this information from the gentlemen of veracity." With that sort of detailed information in hand, merchants in places like Newport, Liverpool, Bristol could plan their next trading ventures, and the more reliable and current that information, the higher the profits would be. Like most every aspect of the trade, the transport of men and goods between the ships and the shore was monopolized by a part of the Anomabo community. The busy traffic was in the hands of the canoemen, who formed a class distinct from all others. Canoes of local construction and measured of the number of rowers they held ranged in size from 3-hand canoe up to the largest 21-hand canoes used to move the largest and heaviest cargoes. The smaller canoes were generally used by the Africans for fishing and other purposes. While Europeans generally employed those from 7 or 15 paddles, larger canoes were more easily overturned than smaller ones, and the 21-hand canoes were rare. The most elaborate canoes had a platform covered by an awning with curtains to protect the traveler from rain or the heat of the sun. Canoemen made their vessels from the local silk cotton tree, which was soft and easily hollowed out with a simple iron chisel when green and hard, but light as cork when dry. These men were extremely skilled at their trade, their rowing timed by their distinctive songs and chants, and only they could expertly navigate the pounding surf along the Gold Coast. Again, another key showing you that you needed Africans to do this and pull this off. Look in front of that, Romer noted that the waves coming rolling in as high as bell towers, you can see them. You can see when the wave will break, and the black boatman must then see to it that the canoes ride on top of the wave before it breaks, or in all haste row their vessels back, letting the wave break first. Should it happen that a wave breaks over the canoe, the vessel will be broken into small pieces, the goods will be lost, and the people, if they cannot swim, will be drowned. Leaving shore with a loaded canoe was far more hazardous than landing. The canoemen were known mischief makers who took great delight in frightening all newly arrived persons, and they did not hesitate upsetting a person against whom they have any spite, but they take great care that a ducking shall be the extent of the injury received. They right the canoe, place their victim in again, leap in themselves, and start once more with the most provoking composure. The canoemen were another large segment of the town's population who had found a profitable niche within the trade system, one that they monopolized, guarded, and used to demonstrate their independence, superior knowledge, and skill. Before trade could begin, the captain had to employ a gold taker, and his role in the process of enslavement was crucial. The gold taker worked to bring brokers with slaves to sell to the ship and weighed and judged the quality of any gold that changed hands, taking a commission on every transaction. The gold takers were highly skilled Atlantic traders, expert metallurgists, and goldsmiths, fluent in local languages, trade languages, and European languages, quick-witted and fast studies both of slaves and traders, fiercely protective of their prerogatives and their crucial role in lucrative trade. According to custom, the first gold taker to board a ship was employed by the vessel, and he was to be employed by the captain on any future visit. Gold takers received payment of cloth, called their sea cloths, which they were given immediately when the ship arrived. And when the ship had loaded all its slaves, they were paid 1 ackee of gold, 1/16 of an ounce, for each captive sold at the Anomabo. Their assistants also received a monthly payment and sustenance while aboard on ship. Either the gold taker or his deputy stayed on board the ship during its time in the road, acted as a scouting agent to bring brokers and their slaves on board, judged the quality of any gold that changed hands during the transactions, and settled any disputes that might have arisen between the European and African traders. Like the canoemen, the gold takers had carved out an important niche for themselves in the trade. The position was inherited and, as Richard Brew discovered, jealously guarded by the guild. In February 1776, Brew's gold taker Aggery introduced him to a bush trader from the northern Fonte state of Abroad named Brennery, who had 1 male slave to sell. In Brew's view, the slave was not worth buying, as Brew's employee Aggery was not supposed to sell slaves on his own account to ships in the road, but in this case, he asked leave to carry the slave into the road to sell him, which Brew agreed he could do. But instead of carrying 1 slave, Aggery carried 4. Customarily, Aggery would take a percentage of the value of a sale between Brew and Brennery. But in this transaction, he cut out his employer and took all the profits for himself. When a bra trader came to the castle Brew for customary dram without Aggery, Brew replied Aggery's chichony by offering to pay Brennery's a higher price for slaves if the two dealt directly without giving a percentage to his gold taker. Brennery reported Brew's proposal to Aggery, who quickly recognized the danger of such a deal posed to the lucrative place he and other gold takers had carved out for themselves. He called a meeting of all the gold takers in Anomabo, which Brew estimated as almost half the inhabitants. No doubt, exaggerated, but with their families' independence, they compose a large and influential segment of the population. Like Aggery, they all recognize the danger and immediately resolve on making a palaver on Brew. So again, big business, gold takers was a big portion of the population. These gold takers were the ones bringing the intermediaries, bringing the African traders to the European traders, and they were making a lot of money off of these transactions. On the evening of February 20th, 1776, an angry mob surrounded the castle Brew, beating every drum in the town, which they continued to do for upwards of 3 hours without intermission, and proclaimed to all the town that no person whatsoever should supply me with the smallest article of provision under penalty of being sold off the coast. The next morning, men were back beating the drums around Castle Brew. They called a meeting of the entire town to discuss the palaver, and they sent delegates to demand rum from Brew to drink during the deliberation. Brew sent 2 gallons, which they refused as being too little. He sent 2 more, which they also rejected, and demanded 16 gallons instead. Brew refused to send that quantity unless they agreed to settle the palaver with it. Angered by Brew's attitude, he reported that they immediately determined on storming my house. About 1 o'clock that afternoon, Brew was shocked by the sound of gunfire, which he took to be part of a burial ceremony, until a shot came through his bedroom window. It hit the ceiling and fell beside his bed, followed by a volley of fire into his bedroom. Brew called together everyone in the house and tried to mount a defense, but on his dismay, he could not find a single musket ball in the house. He set people to work making them from lead bars. While that work was on the way, the castle was surrounded by 1,000 men who kept up continued fire upon us from every quarter and shot one of my people through the body. They set fire to a part of his compound, which our women put out the greatest risk imaginable of their lives. Once the balls were made, Brew posted about a dozen men on the roof. They fired down into the crowd, which quickly dispersed. Brew was outraged by the hellish affair, carried out, he noted, within 50 yards of the most respectable fort on the coast in the noonday. Shaken by the attack, Brew wrote, "Till this blessed time, I always imagined I had liberty to dispose of my goods to who I thought proper, town man or bushman. I also thought I had liberty of speech that I may tell a trader the price without bringing my life and property in danger. He concluded that it's high time for us to pack up our sails and be gone. So the Africans didn't like them trying to cut them out, the gold takers. So they surrounded this trader's house, lit him up, shot somebody, basically let them know we ain't going for it. And it just shows how involved these people were. They were so involved. They were like, no, you ain't cutting us out of the gold takers. We very important and we making a lot of money. Now you ain't cutting us out. So it says here, despite his protests, he was aware of his mistake in challenging the gold takers, although he continued to criticize them for raising the prices of slaves and then spending the profits on dissipation and drunkenness at the waterside. I told you these people were getting fucked up off the money and the proceeds. They was relaxed. They was kicking it with the money. A lot of these people was kicking it. They was flossing. Now, well, you about to see. The next page is going to show you what they were doing with this money. So he basically like, man, these people just getting drunk off the money, man. Right from the fort, Richard Miles said that he would have stepped in to settle the palaveers had anyone notified him of it. He claimed that the mob dispersed once he sent messages to demand an end to the attack. He guaranteed Brew that the attack will not be repeated, but he added, I do not at all wonder at their asking satisfaction from you, as by your own confession you have proclaimed them as a set of thieves without provocation. This dispute between Brew and the gold takers opens a window onto the conduct of slave trade at Anomabo and the crucial role the gold takers played in that traffic. Every major slave trader at Anomabo employed a gold taker, just as Brew employed Aggery, who worked exclusively for him. They brought the brokers to the traders and took a percentage of the trade from both parties as a brokerage fee. If the inland traders sold ivory along with slaves, as they frequently did, then the gold takers also took a hefty markup on that traffic. The merchants sold goods to the inland traders, cloth, gunpowder, or weapons, as they usually did, then the gold taker took a markup on the goods as well. The inland traders lodged with the gold takers. British officials alleged that the gold takers watered down alcohol and diluted gunpowder before turning those goods over to the inland traders. The fort employed its own gold taker who performed the same services for the CMTA. Other gold takers worked for the captains of the slave ships, but since they took a percentage on the sale and purchase of every slave, they changed hands in Anomabo and percentage of all the gold that exchanged hands there. It is easy to see how important and lucrative their professions could be. The prosperous gold takers displayed their wealth and status when they approached the ships. They were described as being brought to the ships in 5-hand canoes, accompanied by assistants who shielded them from the sun with handsome umbrellas. Their appearance was distinctive. Traditionally, their heads were shaved, except for a small patch on the side from which hung a handsome gold ornament. Round their wrists were agary beads mixed with string charmed by their fetish man or priest. Also, heavy gold manillas in the form of snakes around each ankle, which was a string of golden ornaments made the shape of little bells, stools, musical instruments, and weapons. Thick gold rings were upon their fingers, and their sandals were made of leather of various colors, beautifully worked in narrow stripes, and a strap of which had large tuft of many colored silks. They wore an ample cloth of native manufacture, stripped blue, white, and red, wrapped around them like a Roman toga, and this was decorated at the lower edge with a fringe of cowries, which rattled with the slightest motion. The agary beads, gold ornaments, and cowries were all marks of wealth and status. When they met the captain, they lowered their wrap from one shoulder and snapped their fingers within his as a sign of friendship, and then followed him into the cabin. The captain showed the gold takers his merchandise, and the two shared a few drams as they prepared to trade. So these people were flossing with the money. They was getting drunk with the money. It was dripped up and draped out with gold and ornaments. It was flexing. It was flexing, man. It says like all successful traders in the Anomabo, the gold takers were sometimes criticized by the European traders as being cunning. They also accused them of preying, especially on the inexperienced captains. Henry Meredith, governor of the Cape Coast Council, noted that the gold takers were encouraged in proportion to their expertness and knowledge, as they were rewarded in proportion to their success. They used much alertness in seeking for trade. and they took care of the exact handsome sums for their trouble. Thomas Melville, governor of the Cape Coast Castle, reported to the African Committee in 1753 that every black man except the gold takers of Anomabo is happy. But these people stated that if we trade, we destroy their business. And though we buy their slaves, they were very angry when we sell them again. In this case, the gold takers complained about the forts buying their slaves and reselling them to ships in the road, which cut them out of substantial proportions of their commissions. Captains could get better prices from the black traders, but some inexperienced captains or those who needed slaves quickly often turned to the fort and paid the premium. The ships became busy places as Fonte merchants came on board to sell their slaves. A growing number of the sons of elite traders lived on board as pawns while their fathers carry out their business transactions. Sailors and the captains moved back and forth from the town to the ships, and between ships, peddlers from the Anomabo circled the ships in their small canoes selling fresh provisions, including plantains, yams, limes, eggs, greens, ducks, poultry, and sheep to slavers. An unnamed writer in Gentleman magazine noted that Anomabo traders and peddlers give the preference of the trade to the shipment rather than the fort, and they will wait many days in the towns under the forts if the sea happened to be rough, and then at the last run all risks rather than not let the captives have the refusal of their slaves. Even in the article provision for the table, it has been constant observation of every chief, and particularly at Anomabo, that they hardly ever had a sheep, fowl, or duck offered them for sale, till it had been the whole round of shipping in the road and brought back seasick and half drowned with salt water. The writer noted that the ships brought the most recent and highest quality goods, and that the traders were often in debt to the forts and were therefore eager to trade with the ships rather than have their profits deducted from their debts. The captains sometimes trusted the gold takers with goods that they sent with their assistance to inland markets to acquire slaves on their behalf. Captains trusted the best traders who promised to make payment within a certain number of days when their servants or boys, as they call them though they be 60 years old, return from the inland countries. They pawned great collars of gold and other large fetishes or exquisite workmanship, which their great men wear and which they will be sure to redeem. If, however, they do not return payment in agreed time, the British traders Panyard is seized, and many of the Negroes of that town where our debtors lived, as we can or as will come to the value of the debt, which we secure aboard, and threaten to carry away with us if they be not redeemed. A palaver followed, and either the debtor was required to pay the debt or delivered himself up instead of the townspeople. Such palavers were common on the coast, but these disputes were usually resolved and seldom resulted in townspeople actually being taken to the Americas. Captains also trusted the goods to the chief merchants of the Anomabo. One 1767 account book from an unidentified Newport captain contains, for example, these entries: "Trusting my lord Augustus Fitzroy 5 ounces gold, and has put his son on board as a pawn, and is to pay me a fine young woman and 1 ounce gold." And real quick, for everybody still listening to this, again, these people will pawn their children for credit, as we can see. And here the exchange was going to be for a young woman and 1 ounce of gold. So he left his son, he pawned his son off to this trader, and he has to make good of this trade by bringing a young woman and 1 ounce of gold. It says, "Sent old Peter Quire 1 ounce of gold, and he is to put his son on board as a pawn, and is to pay me gold in 1 week or a fine young woman." The captain gave my lord Augustus Fitzroy, who was John Corante's son, usually referred to in the record simply as my lord, trade goods valued at 5 ounces of gold, and held his son as a pawn for repayment either in gold or with a slave. A transaction he repeated with old Peter. Anomabo traders relied on this type of credit to allow them to purchase slaves, even putting their children in the hands of the captains to guarantee the loans. Captains needed to be able to evaluate the reliability of the traders when making these advances, which gave experienced captains an advantage. The transaction sometimes ended badly, and disputes could have serious consequences of the trade. It was in everyone's interest to prevent the trade disputes from getting out of hand. The CMTA officials and Fonte Cabeceres attempted to negotiate peaceful resolutions to trade disputes according to the mutually accepted rules of the governing trade. I think I'm gonna stop here. I think we got to adjust here. We got to adjust because I'm about to end right here. So I'm gonna leave it there. We got enough of it out. You guys should know that without the African involvement, without these people going in, warring with these other tribes, capturing these tribes, and then forcing tributaries on them where they would have to provide more slaves, it would not be a transatlantic slave trade. You have these bush traders going in, kidnapping neighboring children and from other tribes, or sometimes within their own tribes. Would never have that. Or the pawning system and the panyaring system. You would never have the transatlantic slave trade. They played a key role, a major role, the biggest role in the transatlantic slave trade by providing the human cargo. And again, a lot of you guys will just avoid this or go around it and act like it didn't happen. For some reason, I'm disregarding the Europeans. How am I disregarding Europeans? I'm just telling it how it is. Without Africans' involvement or intervention, there will be no slave trade. They played the biggest role because they provide the human cargo through various means, as we read today, right? Through various means. No African involvement, no slave trade. I hope you guys learned something. My backup channel will be up soon. Sub-Saharan African Network. So be on the lookout for that. I hope you guys glean something from this, man. Stop with the romanticizing of history, the trying to Walt Disney history. Black Africans played a major role in the slave trade. And that's the motherfucking deal.
Yeah. Sound good to me. This sound hard. Something funky people gon' dance to. Give the record a second and a chance to. Hitting people like a scene of amazement. While they slipping back, my feet just planted in the pavement. Crumble I can never do. So now I'm looking dead at you. What are you gonna do? You listen to the knowledge of a scholar. You say how I breathe, tell them how I holler. I'm the E-double, and I proclaim my name. Straight up, good gang, peeps all game. I'm like a rhino, running through the roughest pack. They figure I'm a trigger happy nigga, so they step back. Breathe. The microphone is who lasts the longest, and who's the strongest. It ain't a game, it's plain to see. You listen to the sounds of breathe. There ain't no future in your front. I never got caught with a kilo, and if you ever do, yo, will never be with me, yo. Serve it in the Cherokee, or maybe it's a Geo. Black on black Benzo, we'll get it up amigo. Never have to worry about my posse getting jumped, cause if we ever do, yo, TB, pop the trunk. Cause we don't go for playing, wanna play, go grab a ball. When I'm on the mic, I ain't for playing, not at all. Cause I clock 10 G's a week, booming at my peak. Always see E sober, but I do get geek. I can give you a job, a place to eat. Hardy, meet your homeboy Marty at a B.O.B. Party taking over, barking like a dog named Rover. I'm picking suckers like a 4-leaf clover. They biting words on the mic, they some cobras. So now they saying egg breeders get no. But ain't no future in your front. There ain't no future in your front. I'm the B, the R to the double E-D, and down with my homie G-A-S-N-O-E, and suckers causing static cause they still be disagreeing. I don't give a, cause I'm from F-L-I-N-T in a city where pity runs slow. If you ever shoot through my city, now you know, cause we are strictly business and we also got a pride. And if you don't like it, I suggest you break wide. Suckers study looking for the ammo in the wire, thinking that illegal is the best for slowly dying. I ain't got time to see a fiend out, to give up all his money and to give up what he got. That's the way I am, MC B cannot be different. Never change the ways for the world or the government. If I was the president, then I would state facts. You leave it up to me, I paint the White House black and ain't no future in your front. There ain't no future in your front. Yeah, I got dollars in my pocket, not from rolling. If I was a fiend, then my gold would be stolen. Put my name Breed on everything I own. And when I get my Jeep, I'm putting Breed on the chrome. Shine it up good, kicking through my neighborhood. Motorola phone, fat rims and a Kenwood. Put the kid around it, and then I'll have it drop. Just because the riding people think I'm selling rocks, but ain't no future in your front. Flash, man, drop that, man. Drop that. True to the rules of the world. Live my life raw, cause I never liked the law. Wear top 10s on my ass, use jeans. Selling big gates and tit for tat to the fiends. Cock much dollars, but I never break a sweat. Time to move out, my posse saying, you got my back and I got yours. What time is it? Tear down the door. It ain't no feature in your front. Never was, cuz. There ain't no feature in your front. Yo, man, let's start this party up, right? Kick out that fat dance.